Maybe we'll start with definition of frontier tech. I think the introduction gave us one kind of definition. So we have our own definition internally within Qualcomm and Qualcomm Ventures. Sateesh, what do you, like, how is your view, or what is your view on what do you define as frontier tech? Because it seems like a catch-all term.
Absolutely. No, I kept thinking about it, and I just felt that it has two different definitions. In an Indian context, to me, frontier tech is the technology that has become relevant for today. It may be deep and it may be cutting edge, but how do you apply that technology in Indian context? But in a very global context, you're really talking about disruptive. When Tesla got started several years ago, or SpaceX, or artificial life, several years ago, to me, that was frontier technology. I think, you're obviously investing in something that's going to help the mankind, but it requires a lot of capital, very, very high risk, and it'll take a lot of time before you know the benefits. But when it comes to, Indian context, I more look at certain things have to come together within the ecosystem to obviously enable, application of certain technologies to bring down the cost or to take technology to the masses, like I think earlier Sharad and co talked about India 1, India 2, India 3. So to me, as an investor, more focused in India, looking at India startups sometimes that are very globally relevant, the whole definition of frontier technologies are technologies that are unique but have applications today and the next few years in India.
Okay. So we are Qualcomm, obviously we are a global company, and so the role that we take, or the way we define is frontier tech is kind of things that will create completely new big markets, right? So something that's going to fundamentally change the world that we know, and that's what we define as frontier tech. And so we are kind of at a cusp of these things. So if you look at like the past 30, 40 years, we had this computing generation where we started getting computers, then we had internet and web-connected generation, then mobile, cloud. So similarly, a big horizontal like this or a big vertical like this that is fundamentally different or fundamentally unique that we haven't seen before is what we call as frontier. And I think we are at a point of a cusp of this thing where 3, 4 such things are starting to happen, right? Whether if you look at the drones as a computing platform, or if you look at connected intelligence or connected machines as a platform, or connected cars. So if you look at all these things, that's what we call as frontier tech. And so the India applicability is interesting. We'll come to that maybe to discuss that a little bit more. So the one question maybe to segue into the next part is that, hey, these all looks big, like great, whether it is drones or whether it is new space programs and things like that. What is the relevance for India, right? So you kind of touched upon this, saying that, hey, this could be folks that are working on these areas and whatnot. But let's change the question a little bit. Do you think Indian entrepreneurs, Indian companies have a chance to define this frontier tech, or is it more or lead this frontier tech, or do you think our role is more around being a part of the ecosystem?
No, I'll come to that, but I want to digress a little bit. My master's project was parallel processing and neural networks on FPGAs. That was like almost 18 years ago. So we've talked about neural networks and artificial intelligence for a very, very, very long time. That's nothing new. The challenge was we did this on Next computers. Steve Jobs' first set of Next computers were deployed in our university when we did this. I think, what we obviously miss is that semiconductors, I strongly believe, drive a lot of these disruptive technologies. I mean, you look at even smartphones. Unless folks like you guys or Broadcoms or the memory technologies or the battery technologies, if they didn't kind of come together, you would not have smartphones at $100. So these are obviously the enablers, and then you see the other guys coming and putting in the building blocks, whether these are network service providers, and then applications happen. Fundamental technologies, problems when we look at, some of these companies today, I mean, if you look at, we're all talking about AI, and obviously AI on a chip is going to be very, very real very soon. The fundamental original traditional Intel architectures and the instruction sets would not be very relevant for AI instructions. And we've already seen that happening in the graphics space. So we're seeing some special purpose chips and special purpose processors kind of happening. When you talk about an overlay of whether it's drones or AR, VR or robotics or machine learning, artificial intelligence, IoT, any of these, in the end, it kind of comes down to hardware.
Yeah.
Obviously that's going to scale, high levels of integration, huge volumes, hence brings down the cost. Then obviously enables OEMs to put these products together and then kind of drives, the market expansion. So kind of long story short, I mean, in Indian context, obviously we had to focus on applications. We look at some stellar software capabilities, but then when you go back to asking them about how are you going to do the data capture, there's no answer. You're dependent on some third-party hardware, in terms of data capture, and that doesn't work.
Right.
So I do believe that applications will be very prevalent in India, but some of the entrepreneurs will obviously go global from day one. They may not tackle India market at all.
Okay. I think
I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, no, so
what you think.
I think that those advantages to the developed markets were there in the past, I think, significantly so. Because like you said, it needed advanced processors or advanced materials or advanced manufacturing methods and whatnot, where it was not possible for us to do that here. So, but I think the innovation is kind of moving up as well, I think, which means that many of this innovation is not just only at that processor, at that level. It's more around putting together a system, putting together a software and whatnot. So for example, if you look at this self-driving cars or autonomous driving cars, there is obviously a hardware element to it where some of this processing happens, but still significant amount remains at the software level, right? And I think even at the hardware level, the hardware ecosystem has progressed so much to the point that there is so much you can take from off the shelf and build things on top of it. For example, the best example is recently we had these 104 satellites that were launched. On most of the satellites that went up in the space were by these two companies, Spire and Planet. Neither one come from a space background. Neither one have, and they basically took components from the smartphone ecosystem and put that together and launched the satellites, right? So I think the role of that fundamental material or advanced processing type of thing will continue to be there. But I think the value stack is shifting more to algorithms, software, systems, putting these things together and whatnot. So I think in that sense, I think from the India ecosystem, I think we should not dream small. I think in the newer frontier things that are coming up, whether it is drones or AR, VR, I think India has as much of a role or even a bigger role to lead actually the change as well.
No, I think we have a huge role. I think the challenge I see that is to bring the solution at a cost, at a price point that the market can accept so that you can scale. And by no means I want to belittle the ability of all these open APIs and the stacks and applications and information and intelligence.
Yeah.
Even if you look at cloud car, obviously there's so much more than just the autonomous vehicle itself.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what I feel is that they have to go hand in hand, and timing plays a very important role. Otherwise, you really need to invest lots of dollars and wait out before you get the results. And so will the venture capitalists and the other investors even look at those kind of opportunities is a big question mark.
Yeah, right. Where do you think the ecosystem is? Maybe let's talk a little bit about the ecosystem. Both of us are venture capitalists in the market here. We look at startups. What is your experience in terms of looking at frontier tech startups in India, and what would be some of the thoughts for entrepreneurs choosing that? And then maybe I'll share some of our thoughts as well.
Sure. No, I think it's very easy to explain consumer startups, right, to any investor because they get it very quickly. But when you get into tech startups, it does require a little bit of deep domain expertise. But that said, I think as a nation of billion plus and majority of them very well educated, I think it's the people in this room and people like us who would have to jumpstart these technology startups. I think there is risk, no doubt, but there is humongous of returns because these returns are non-linear returns. If you look at purchase of all the companies, whether it's Mobileye or Nirvana or any of these exits, they're completely non-linear exits. So a lot of times the challenge for someone like us who focus on seed and pre-series A is to collect enough capital so that these companies achieve metrics and credibility before we go to big brothers like you guys. But I know that at times you also kind of come in very early. So the biggest challenge for some of the tech investors is really how do you get enough of follow-on investment, because it always takes longer and it costs you more when you build these kinds of startups. So, but I see that changing very fast, and I'm very, very optimistic that in next 2 to 3 years, a significant amount of capital is going to go, and there are some funds that are obviously raised, dedicated funds that are raised to invest in these kinds of sectors.
Yeah. So we've been looking at tech startups for 10 years, right? But I would say that we are definitely at a different inflection point today. The best example for us was last year we have this seed investment program called Q-Prize. We did last year just focusing only around hardware and kind of designed in India type of a hardware ecosystem focused Q-Prize. We were worried whether there are enough companies at the early stage to actually see or not. We were surprised, actually, we got like 500 companies in 10 days. And then we picked a company which was doing robotics, Arc Robot, the guys are here. So what we felt was that I think there are a lot more ideas being thought through. Anytime when you're looking at a startup, one of the first questions is, why is this problem interesting? And then the second question typically people ask is, why now? What has changed now? Why is the problem interesting now, right? So I think that's what's relevant, I would say, for some of these things is that we go through this, if you just look at history as a guide, right? We go through this building of this platform and then and then having applications on top of the platform, right? So if you look at the late 90s and mid 2000s, the mobile architecture was getting built out. We're building, whether it's chipsets or whether it is connectivity platforms and things like that, without knowing what the application could be. The famous question in early 2000s was, what is the killer app for a 3G phone? And then we didn't go through this whole phase of application phase in the last 10 years. We've been seeing mobile first and several mobile-focused solutions. So I think we're at a point where there is a need for new platforms as well. I think the next 10 years, I believe there's a bunch of new platforms could be developed without worrying as much about, hey, what would be the exact end application for an end consumer is going to be. Right? First, we got to build the infrastructure first. So I think in that sense, focusing on frontier tech today makes a lot of sense because we are at a point where we can use a lot of the technologies and look at completely new platforms, completely new applications. So, in that sense, I think that timing-wise, this next few years are good. I think there are a lot of fledgling platforms today, whether it is drones or whether it is AR, whether it is VR, whether mixed reality and things like that. But I think over the next few years, things are going to get defined. And then after that, more applications on this will come. I think whoever now gets to be part of this building of these pillars will stand to gain significant value creation as well. So
I think you're letting out many secrets out of the bag. I'm just kidding. So I think one of the key things is, entrepreneurs have to have deep domain expertise. I think that's something that we see very, very clearly. And the second thing is that they need to really understand the product and the customer. Not that it is not important in any other business, but in this particular business, you need to understand, your customer and your competition. And 3, you need to have the ability to go compete globally. I mean, you're talking about competing with, of course, large amounts of capital and the brain power when you go against Valley or Israel. I'm not saying you don't win those battles, but you need to have the appetite and the understanding to be able to go do that. So I think these are some of the things we look for in teams when we do the funding. But I'm very, very excited. Almost every month, we're just seeing the quality of these plans, better and better, people thinking better and better. It's a connected world,
Right.
and I'm very, very optimistic.
Okay. The two things you brought up, maybe worth discussing for the investors here and startups here as well. The two things that you said was, one is, hey, to get follow-on funding and others, it's an issue, and that needs to be addressed. Second thing is, a lot of times these are global markets. It's not necessarily an India-specific frontier tech. It's a frontier tech, it's a frontier tech. So which means its applicability is global, which means they need to go compete against the Silicon Valley companies and whatnot, right? So which means they have to have significant presence there or need to move there and whatnot, or raise money there, right? So those two things, should when we look at this, or when you guys look at these investments in frontier tech, do you look at these as an important things that the capital available here in India is limited, so they have to move to US, or the market is in the US, they have to move to US? So how do you guys look at it? You can talk about.
Yeah, sure. No, we do a little bit of due diligence, more from the demand side in terms of both the follow-on capital and are they in the strategic roadmap of some of the large companies. The other piece is that there's no choice. I'm not saying that all of these guys, I mean, there are a bunch of our investments where they're completely focused on India market, and if they're lucky, the timing is still relevant for them to go globally expand, right? So, but if some of these folks have had the prior experience of working in global markets and they know the market from day one and they know that they're relevant for those markets, they have no choice but to move there very quickly, engage with analysts, engage with customers there, engage with channel partners there, and then they become even interesting for a global set of investor audience for follow-on rounds of funding.
Yeah, I think that's still an open question.
Yeah.
Where the company needs to move, and then whether the capital needs to be raised here versus there.